Not everyone gets noticed by a billionaire by simply showing up, Emily whispered to herself as she adjusted her crisp white apron, the polished marble floors of Blackwood Tower reflecting the soft morning light in long, angled strips across the lobby. She had arrived early, as usual, carrying a tray of carefully arranged pastries, her hands brushing the delicate porcelain edges, when suddenly a presence larger than the room itself seemed to fill the space. And there he was, Alexander Blackwood, standing tall in a tailored navy suit that caught the gleam of the chandeliers above, his piercing blue eyes scanning the lobby with a precision that made the air feel denser, heavier, charged. Emily's breath hitched, not out of fear but awe, as her mind scrambled to remember the signs she had practiced, the ones that would allow her to communicate silently, invisibly. And yet, in this moment, everything seemed magnified. The rustle of her skirt, the soft tap of her shoes against the polished stone, the subtle scent of coffee from the side counter-mingling with the faint aroma of the pastries she held. With a shaking hand, she lifted her palm and began to sign, slow, deliberate motions conveying a polite morning greeting, her eyes locking with his across the distance, catching the faintest arch of his brow, a silent acknowledgement that seemed to freeze time. The bustling lobby around them fading into a soft blur of light and shadow. Alexander tilted his head slightly, curiosity flickering across his features, a smile barely perceptible. And in that instant, Emily realized the power of presence, of human connection without words, of the small but significant act of courage that could ripple through a world dominated by wealth and influence. The soft click of security boots approached, a measured, calm sound that contrasted sharply with the rapid pounding of her own heart, and she felt a surge of conflicting emotions, nervous yet exhilarated, intimidated yet emboldened, each step echoing through the grand hall as she walked past the gleaming reception desk, trays of pastries balanced expertly in her hands, her gaze briefly meeting Alexander's once more, lingering just enough for an unspoken understanding to pass between them. An acknowledgement of something deeper than the surface, a hint of destiny weaving its intricate threads around two lives that had never been meant to cross, yet now hung suspended in the delicate balance of curiosity, fate, and the quiet assertion of individuality in a world built on power and expectation. As she moved toward the staircase leading to the upper floors, the sunlight streaming through the tall windows caught the strands of her hair, creating a halo-like effect, and Alexander followed her silently with his gaze, every subtle movement of her figure imprinted into his memory, a quiet fascination settling in that would grow with each encounter, each gesture, each shared glance, setting the stage for a story neither of them could have predicted, yet would shape the coming days in ways both profound and quietly relentless. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the executive floor, casting long golden stripes across the polished oak panels as Emily stepped cautiously into the hallway, her hands still carrying the tray of carefully arranged pastries, the subtle weight of responsibility pressing gently on her shoulders, each step measured, precise, her eyes briefly catching the glint of the brass nameplate that read Alexander Blackwood, a reminder that she was entering a world apart from the kitchens and service corridors she knew so well. The silence was punctuated only by the soft echo of her shoes against the marble, a rhythm that matched the quiet, steady pulse of anticipation in her chest, and she felt the cool air brushing against her skin, a contrast to the warm sunlight streaming in from the windows behind her, creating a delicate play of shadow and light along the walls. As she reached the threshold of a spacious office adorned with sleek, minimalist furnishings and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, Alexander rose from his leather chair, his tailored navy suit reflecting the subtle gleam of the morning light, and he regarded her with an intensity that made her fingers tighten slightly around the tray, a mixture of curiosity and admiration flickering across his features, the kind of look that did not demand explanation, yet carried the weight of quiet expectation, compelling her attention entirely. Emily took a careful step forward, signaling a polite greeting once again with her hands, the motion deliberate and controlled, her eyes locking briefly with his. And in that fleeting exchange, a bridge was built without a single word spoken, a silent acknowledgement of presence and awareness. and she felt an unfamiliar but not unwelcome warmth in her chest as she realized that. He was noticing not just her appearance, but the subtle precision, the careful intention behind each gesture, each motion, a recognition that transcended the ordinary routines of her daily life. Alexander gestured toward the window, inviting her to set the tray down, and as she did, the sunlight caught the edges of the pastries, highlighting the delicate textures and subtle colors, a small detail that seemed to momentarily distract him, and Emily allowed herself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile, sensing that her presence, her careful attention, had made an impression, and yet the space between them was charged with an unspoken tension, a sense of potential that could unfold in countless ways, the kind of moment that existed in the suspended interval between greeting and understanding. As she straightened slightly, adjusting the neat lines of her uniform, she noticed Alexander leaning back slightly, hands resting lightly on the polished surface of his desk, eyes still fixed on her, a contemplative expression suggesting that he was weighing not just what was in front of him, but the possibilities inherent in this unexpected encounter. And Emily felt both exposed and seen, a rare combination that made her pulse quicken with quiet excitement. The hallway beyond remained empty, the world outside continuing its normal rhythm, while inside, the two of them shared a space defined by subtle gestures, careful glances, and a growing awareness of connection and understanding. That words were not always necessary to communicate significance. And as Emily turned to leave, following the soft hum of the office air, she felt the weight of possibility pressing gently but insistently on the edges of her thoughts, a quiet, persistent promise of a story yet to be fully revealed, one that would unfold in the hours, the gestures, and the silent exchanges to come. Emily moved carefully down the quiet hallway, the soft echo of her shoes blending with the faint hum of the building's air system, each step deliberate as she tried to steady the fluttering of her chest, her mind replaying the brief encounter she had just shared, the subtle tension and the unspoken connection that lingered in the air like a delicate fragrance. The office doors around her were sleek, reflecting the soft morning light, and she caught glimpses of her reflection, the neat lines of her uniform precise, her hair tucked carefully behind her ears, and a quiet determination settling in her shoulders as she realized that this floor, this level of the building, was a space governed by more than just hierarchy. It was a world of attention and intent, where every glance and gesture carried meaning beyond the obvious. Alexander, seated again behind his polished mahogany desk, observed her from across the room with a quiet intensity, his blue eyes tracking her movements, noting the grace and precision in her steps, the way her fingers brushed lightly against the tray, each motion small yet deliberate, a reflection of the care and thoughtfulness she brought to even the most mundane tasks. And he felt an unexpected fascination, a curiosity about the woman who moved through his world with both confidence and humility, who seemed to inhabit both the service and the space of power without disrupting either. Emily set the tray down with careful attention to detail, arranging the pastries just so, the sunlight highlighting the soft textures and delicate colors, and Alexander allowed himself a moment to appreciate the small, deliberate choices she made, the care in her work, the subtle assertion of individuality within the constraints of her role, and he found himself leaning slightly forward, elbows resting lightly on the desk, as if drawn by an invisible thread, a silent acknowledgement that this moment, this quiet exchange, mattered more than he had expected. She turned slightly, adjusting her posture, signaling another greeting with a brief, fluid motion of her hands, and he recognized the precision and thoughtfulness, the silent language that spoke volumes, and it made him pause, a sensation both rare and compelling, the awareness that someone could communicate with such clarity and subtlety without words, and it was not lost on him that the world outside this office continued its relentless pace. Unaware of the delicate dance occurring within these walls, Emily felt a subtle rush of pride and nervousness simultaneously, a recognition that she was seen, understood in ways that transcended her expectations, and yet there was still a tension, a question of what would come next. As she prepared to leave, the tray carefully carried back toward the hallway, and Alexander remained seated, eyes following her, a quiet, thoughtful expression settling across his features, aware that this encounter, brief and wordless though it was, had already begun to alter the contours of his day, planting seeds of curiosity and consideration that would inevitably grow, shaping the hours to come in a manner both unexpected and profoundly human. And as Emily passed the threshold back into the quieter corridors, the sunlight catching the subtle highlights in her hair, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and anticipation, knowing that this was only the beginning of a story neither of them had anticipated. Yet both were now quietly invested in unfolding. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the upper floors, Emily returned to her duties with a subtle awareness that the world she had briefly entered was not quite as separate from her own as she had imagined. Each step along the corridor felt lighter, yet charged with an energy she could not name, a resonance from the quiet acknowledgement she had received earlier, the fleeting exchange that lingered like a gentle echo in her mind, shaping her thoughts and gestures with a newfound precision. Alexander, observing from the corner of his office, watched the soft sway of her movement as she balanced trays and attended to the small details of the space, the contrast between her humility and meticulous attention commanding a quiet respect, a fascination that he had not anticipated but could not ignore, and he leaned back, fingers steepled in contemplation, noting the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the way her posture carried confidence without pretense, the quiet assertion of presence that spoke volumes without uttering a single word. Emily paused briefly by the floor-to-ceiling window, gazing out at the city below, the streets glimmering with the reflection of the sun off steel and glass, and she allowed herself a slow breath, sensing the momentary pause between the past encounter and the possibilities unfolding, her eyes catching the faint glimmer of light off the silver tray she held, her reflection mingling with the skyline, a silent reminder of the unexpected intersection of her world with his. Alexander stood, walking slowly toward the window, his gaze following the contours of the city before settling briefly on her. The air between them filled with an unspoken acknowledgement of curiosity and anticipation, the silent language they shared expanding subtly with each gesture, each glance, a delicate exchange that required no verbal explanation, yet conveyed an intricate understanding of intention, attention, and presence. Emily returned to arranging items on the countertop, hands precise and movements deliberate, yet she felt a subtle warmth in the awareness that her actions had not gone unnoticed, that someone whose world seemed so far removed from hers had registered her care, her thoughtfulness, her subtle ability to communicate through motion and focus, and it stirred a quiet confidence, a recognition that her small but deliberate choices had meaning beyond the immediate task. The office space, the polished surfaces, the gleam of sunlight, the quiet hum of the building all seemed to align in a soft rhythm, a backdrop to a connection forming in nuances and subtleties. Alexander observing without interruption, Emily performing without distraction, each aware of the other, in a delicate balance of attention and presence. As she prepared to leave the office, adjusting her uniform with precise care, she felt a gentle anticipation, a sense that the unfolding hours held new encounters, new exchanges, and the quiet promise of moments that would extend the brief connection into something more profound and enduring, a story shaped by presence, observation, and the subtle power of unspoken understanding, carrying both of them into a narrative that had only just begun to reveal its depth and significance. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the upper floors of Blackwood Tower, casting long golden reflections on the polished surfaces as Emily moved with measured grace, her hands carrying fresh linens and trays, each step a quiet assertion of her presence in a world that often overlooked those who served quietly. Alexander, seated in his office, observed from a distance, his posture relaxed but attentive, blue eyes tracking her subtle movements, noting the way her fingers adjusted the folds of fabric, the careful alignment of trays, the gentle arch of her neck as she glanced at the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, each motion precise, deliberate, yet somehow infused with a soft, human warmth that contrasted with the calculated efficiency of the corporate environment around them. The silence between them was filled with unspoken acknowledgement, a shared rhythm of awareness and observation, and Emily felt a growing sense of calm confidence, realizing that her quiet Dedication was being noticed, appreciated in a way that required no words, only the delicate language of gestures and attention. She paused briefly by a low shelf to arrange items with careful symmetry, sunlight catching the edges of silver and porcelain, and Alexander rose, moving slowly toward the window to follow the interplay of light and reflection across the room. A subtle tension threading the space as he considered the curious impact of her presence, the unexpected way she had shifted. The atmosphere with nothing more than focus and quiet precision. Emily straightened, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, her eyes catching a fleeting glance from him. And in that instant, the world outside the office seemed to slow, the distant hum of traffic, the faint murmur of other staff, all fading into a background hum as the connection of attention and awareness lingered, delicate but unmistakable, a bridge between two lives intersecting in small, meaningful ways. The tray she carried seemed heavier and lighter simultaneously, weighted by responsibility, yet lifted by the recognition that her care and thoughtfulness had impact beyond the immediate task, and she allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible smile, acknowledging the quiet satisfaction of being seen and appreciated for the subtleties that defined her work. Alexander returned to his desk, hands resting lightly on polished wood, eyes thoughtful as he considered the unfolding dynamic, the silent dialogue carried in gestures, glances, and measured movements, recognizing that influence and connection could manifest in forms far more nuanced than meetings or emails, in the careful presence and subtle precision of someone who moved through his world with quiet grace. As Emily prepared to leave the office, setting down the remaining items with careful attention, the sunlight catching the edges of the glass and silver, she sensed a gentle anticipation, a promise of further encounters and subtle exchanges that could shape the hours to come, a quiet narrative forming between the lines of routine and expectation, carried forward in gestures, in observation, and in the delicate, unspoken understanding that had begun to emerge between them, marking the beginning of a story defined by presence, attentiveness, and the soft but persistent power of human connection. The evening sun cast a warm amber glow across the upper floors, stretching long shadows over the polished marble and sleek office surfaces as Emily carried a small stack of documents carefully across the quiet hallway, her steps measured, each movement deliberate, a soft hum of concentration underlining the precision she applied to every task. Alexander, seated behind his desk, watched her with a calm intensity, noting the gentle way she adjusted a misplaced folder, the subtle care in her posture, the way her eyes briefly lifted to acknowledge the sunlight spilling through the windows, and he felt a quiet admiration for the conscientiousness she displayed, the combination of humility and attentiveness that made her presence feel significant in a space otherwise defined by schedules and routines. Emily paused for a moment to straighten a slightly askew set of pens, the sunlight catching the silver tips and throwing tiny reflections across the desktop, and she felt the weight of observation lightly pressing at her awareness, a soft acknowledgement that her efforts did not go unnoticed, that even in the absence of words, the attention given to her actions by someone as perceptive as Alexander carried meaning, and it encouraged a subtle confidence to carry forward with grace and diligence. Alexander rose slowly, stepping toward the window to watch the city below, the reflective glass mirroring the room behind him, and his gaze lingered on Emily as she resumed her tasks, the quiet rhythm of her movements creating a gentle counterpoint to the structured energy of the office environment, each gesture imbued with an understated elegance, a sense of purpose that resonated beyond the immediate work she performed. Emily felt a soft warmth in the awareness that her presence influenced the space, that careful attention to detail could create a ripple of perception, a silent recognition that extended from the small gestures of folding documents and aligning trays to the subtler art of presence and awareness. And she carried that sense forward, mindful of each step, each motion, each glance as she navigated the hallway. The faint hum of distant activity in the building contrasted with the focused quiet between the two, a tension not of conflict but of potential, an unspoken dialogue of observation, mutual acknowledgement, and gentle curiosity, and it created a subtle, almost electric undercurrent that filled the air without words, As Emily approached the staircase, sunlight brushing against her hair, she felt a quiet anticipation for the next exchange, aware that these moments of careful attention, subtle gestures, and mutual awareness were shaping a narrative that unfolded. Incrementally, each instance a thread weaving into the larger story, and Alexander, returning to his desk after a slow moment of contemplation, remained deeply attentive, recognizing that the connection, however understated, was both meaningful and rare, and that the unspoken interactions between them were slowly defining the rhythm of the hours to come, marking the beginning of a shared understanding and quiet rapport built entirely on presence, attentiveness, and the nuanced language of observation and care. The golden hue of late afternoon bathed the upper floors in a warm, reflective glow, and Emily moved with quiet determination, her hands carrying a neatly stacked bundle of folders, each step deliberate, resonating softly against the polished floors, a rhythm of attentiveness that seemed to mark time in a world defined by precision and subtlety. Alexander, observing from his desk, noted the careful alignment of papers, the deliberate motion of her fingers as she adjusted the edges and corners, the gentle shift of her posture as she leaned slightly to reach a shelf, and he felt a quiet fascination, an admiration for the attention she brought to even the simplest tasks, the understated care that suggested a depth of character beyond what the initial impression could convey. Emily paused briefly to straighten a chair by the window, sunlight reflecting in soft patterns on the floor, and she allowed herself a slow breath, conscious of the subtle awareness that Alexander's gaze followed. Her movements, not intrusively but with measured curiosity, an acknowledgement that lent significance to the quiet routine of her duties and encouraged a subtle confidence to carry forward with grace and focus. The office, usually marked by a sterile efficiency, seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, each detail of her work, each careful gesture, magnified by the attentive observation, and she became acutely aware of the invisible dialogue unfolding between them, a conversation without words yet, filled with meaning. The acknowledgement of effort and presence forming a bridge that was both delicate and substantial, connecting them in a silent understanding. Alexander rose slowly, walking to the window to observe the city below, the sunlight glinting off the glass facades and casting reflections across the office, his attention still on her, noticing the way her hair caught the light, the precise motions of her hands as she set down the folders, the quiet elegance in her movements that communicated both competence and care, a silent message that resonated with his own understanding of presence and attention. Emily straightened her uniform, taking in a brief moment to survey the room, her mind reflecting on the subtle weight of the recognition she felt, the quiet encouragement that came from being observed with thoughtful attention, and she felt a growing sense of purpose, an understanding that her presence mattered in ways she had not anticipated, that her gestures, however small, were meaningful and noted, and this awareness shaped the deliberate precision of her next actions. The distant hum of the building and the soft echo of her shoes created a subtle backdrop as she moved toward the staircase, sunlight catching her movements, creating a visual rhythm of light and shadow. And Alexander returned to his desk, thoughtful, hands lightly resting on polished wood, considering how an encounter so understated could leave a lasting impression. Each small gesture, each quiet acknowledgement contributing to a developing narrative, a story forming in the spaces between observation and action, attention and recognition, that was entirely their own. Emily's final glance toward the office reflected a mixture of quiet anticipation and steady resolve, aware that these moments of mutual awareness and silent dialogue had begun to shape a path forward, a rhythm of interaction defined by subtlety, precision, and the understated power of presence, leaving both of them poised on the edge of further discovery, each carrying the unspoken potential of what was yet to unfold in the hours and encounters to come. The golden light of late afternoon faded gradually into a soft, muted glow as Emily moved down the hallway, her hands carrying the last of the organized folders, each step measured, the polished floors reflecting the subtle warmth of the sun, and she felt a quiet satisfaction in the precision of her work, the gentle rhythm of her movements bringing a sense of calm order to the expansive space. Alexander, observing from his desk, noted the careful way she aligned the documents, the slight tilt of her head as she adjusted the edges, the delicate attention she paid to the smallest details, and he felt an unexpected admiration for the quiet diligence she displayed, the understated grace that made every simple action feel significant, a testament to her character and awareness. Emily paused briefly at the large window to survey the skyline, the buildings glimmering with the last rays of sunlight, and she allowed herself a slow breath, the quiet anticipation of what might come next mingling with the satisfaction of completing her tasks, a subtle sense of presence filling her awareness, heightened by the knowledge that her work and careful attention had been noticed and appreciated. Alexander rose from his desk, walking slowly to the window to observe both the city and the quiet, measured movements of Emily as she resumed her steps toward the office exit, noting the way sunlight caught the strands of her hair, the gentle sway of her uniform, the careful, deliberate gestures that communicated as much through action as words ever could, and he felt a quiet curiosity and anticipation for the interactions that would follow, recognizing the rarity and value of such understated connection. Emily adjusted the neat lines of her uniform and carried herself with composed intent, aware of the attentive observation but not distracted by it, allowing the silent dialogue of awareness, precision, and presence to shape each gesture, each placement of a folder or tray, a nuanced communication that required no spoken language yet conveyed attention, care, and understanding. The faint hum of the building, distant voices from lower floors, and the soft clink of silver and porcelain formed a subtle backdrop, a rhythm that accentuated the delicate dynamic forming between them. And Emily felt the quiet empowerment of being seen for her deliberate actions and thoughtful presence, a validation that extended beyond mere acknowledgement and resonated. On a deeper, personal level, Alexander returned to his desk, hands resting lightly on polished wood, eyes thoughtful as he considered the evolving rhythm of attention and care, the unspoken connection built through observation, subtle gestures, and mutual awareness. Realizing that influence and respect could be communicated without words, each small movement between them carrying significance and shaping the narrative that unfolded quietly, yet profoundly. As Emily prepared to leave the office, adjusting the folds of her uniform one last time, she felt a gentle sense of anticipation, a recognition that the careful, deliberate exchanges throughout the day had created a silent but meaningful rapport. A story slowly developing between them that promised further moments of observation, awareness, and shared understanding. And as she moved toward the staircase, the soft glow of evening light illuminating the space, both of them remained poised on the edge of continued discovery, connected through the quiet, nuanced language of attention and presence that had begun to define the hours and interactions yet to come. As the day transitioned into early evening, the soft glow of sunset poured through the tall windows, casting a warm amber light that danced across the polished surfaces of the executive floor, and Emily moved with a quiet confidence, her hands carrying the last of the neatly stacked folders, each step measured and deliberate. The faint echo against the marble floor marking a rhythm that seemed to mirror the unspoken connection forming between her and Alexander. He stood near the large window, arms resting lightly on the polished wood of his desk, eyes following her movements with a focused calm, noting the careful way she aligned each folder, the subtle adjustment of her posture as she navigated the space, the precision in her gestures that spoke of both diligence and mindfulness. And he felt a quiet admiration, a recognition that the understated attention she brought to every task carried meaning far beyond the immediate work. Emily paused for a moment near the corner of the room, sunlight catching the strands of her hair and the edges of the documents she held, and she allowed herself a slow breath, the soft warmth of recognition settling over her, an awareness that the careful, silent observation by Alexander imbued her actions with a sense of significance and quiet purpose, reinforcing her confidence in the delicate balance of presence and attentiveness that had developed throughout the day. Alexander moved slowly to his chair, hands lightly resting on the armrests, yet his eyes remained fixed on her, noting the gentle flow of her movements, the deliberate yet graceful motions that conveyed thoughtfulness, discipline, and an unspoken communication, a silent dialogue of gestures and awareness that deepened with each passing moment, connecting them in a way that required no words yet resonated profoundly. Each small act reinforcing a shared understanding of presence and respect. Emily set the folders down with precise care on the designated surface, aligning them neatly, the sunlight highlighting the subtle textures and colors, and she felt a quiet thrill of satisfaction, knowing that her effort, her attention to detail, had been observed and silently acknowledged, an affirmation of the importance of mindfulness and intentionality in every motion. The faint hum of the building, distant footsteps of other staff, and soft creaks of polished wood created a gentle backdrop, a rhythm that accentuated the silent interaction between them, a nuanced dialogue that expanded in subtle glances, measured gestures, and the careful orchestration of presence, each instance contributing to a growing awareness of shared understanding and quiet rapport. Alexander remained seated, hands lightly clasped, eyes thoughtful, recognizing the rare significance of such understated exchanges, the way small, deliberate acts of care and attention could convey connection, trust, and appreciation without a single word, and he felt a quiet curiosity for what the coming moments might reveal as their interactions continued to unfold. Emily, having completed her tasks, straightened her uniform, adjusted a stray lock of hair, and allowed herself one final glance toward him, a mixture of anticipation and reflection filling her mind, sensing that this day, this series of small yet meaningful exchanges, had created a foundation for further discovery, a narrative quietly building between them through the shared language of presence, attentiveness, and silent understanding, leaving both poised on the edge of continued connection and subtle revelation as the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden reflections across the room and into the hours yet to come.